Thank you. Well, it's really lovely to talk to you. And what we're going to talk about tonight is about leadership. And I've chosen that topic because I think leadership is extremely important in life. And all of you, although you may feel that that's not what you do, we're all leaders within our own small environments, in our families, in our peer group, our friendship group. And actually many of you who are students or who are in responsible jobs, you are leaders. You are leaders in your Christian group. And we need to think about how leadership is most effective and how Christian leadership can really help us. Now I'm going to share a few slides if I may. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if this works. We've all got used to. Is that okay? Can you see my screen? So there are a lot of bad models of leadership in the world. So we've all been standing, looking aghast at Donald Trump when he does all his weird things. And people need to stop obsessing over my Russian ties. And of course, Putin and Trump have very different styles of leadership. And I don't think either of them are good leaders. President Xi in China is a very powerful leader. He's certainly oppressing people. He's pushing China forward, but he's doing it at the cost to many people, the Uyghurs, the people of Hong Kong, and the Christian church in China, which is really struggling at the moment. In the UK, we have Boris. I'm sure you've seen a little bit of Boris, and he is, in some ways, he's a good leader. He models himself on Winston Churchill, but I don't think he's quite got the story, quite got it right. But he has led us into really some difficulties with all of our COVID stuff, but also as a moral leader, he really lacks much credibility. But it's not just political leaders. I don't know about your leaders in your country, so I'm not talking about them, but I do know that across so many parts of the world, of the ecosystem, leaders do not give a very good example. So I just bought a book on Amazon that I saw advertised on Facebook after I searched on Google. The tech giants have too much power. And of course, so much of our lives, we are using these technology giants to do so much. And the consequence is that enormous amount of money and power is accumulating in the hands of a very small number of people at the top of those tech giants. And that leads to distortion and exploitation. We've seen it in Hollywood. We've seen it in many areas of business. And sadly, we've even seen it in the church. And in the church, leadership is also a challenge. We've seen the widespread failure to confront sexual exploitation in the church. We've seen division, the historic divisions in the Christian church, which have left us open to criticism. And I think often at a local level, those petty power struggles between people whose own sense of themselves has become expressed through controlling their local church or their congregation. I see it too in the university. At the University of Oxford, where I live and I work, I live about a mile away from where this drawing might have been taken. And we call the professors in Oxford, we call them dons. And here this cartoon, which makes them look like gangsters. In universities, just like in business, the leaders can operate through a lot of power. And in Oxford, the heads of department have almost unfettered power to prioritize, to recruit, to control, to reward. And money and prestige are the household gods in Oxford University, money and prestige. I think in families also we see a loss of older patterns of male paternalism, which in many ways is a good thing, but in so many families it's been replaced by two individuals who go their own separate ways, and sadly often only one parent. So wherever we look across the world, we see different patterns of leadership, and largely, I think, a crisis of leadership. But I think, in contrast, I hope that you can think of an outstanding example of leadership in your own community or your wider network. Can you just stop and think now about who it is that you would really look to? Is there an example of somebody who you can think of, who you think is a really excellent leader? I want to point you to Jesus, because it struck me more and more as I've gone on as a Christian. I've been increasingly struck by the way his character and his model and what he calls us to are the complete opposite of the leadership we see in the world. And his model is so radical and different that we really need to think about it. And that example is expressed here. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul is talking about how we should relate to each other. And he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And what was the example that he said? Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So we're coming up to Easter, and our readings are beginning to think about the time that Jesus died on the cross. And it is extraordinary to me that he came from eternity, from heaven. He was the creator, and he left all of that behind. He made himself as nothing, like a servant. He could not have been in a more vulnerable position in the world. Born to a young mother, questions about the legitimacy of his birth, born in an obscure quarter of the Roman Empire, an oppressed and occupied nation. Born in a home where there wasn't enough room inside the house for the mother and baby, so his first resting place was the food trough for the animals. He and his family became refugees. He grew up in a despised part of his own country, which most of the educated, smart people thought nothing good came from there. There was nothing attractive in the terms of what the world wants to look for. It's hard to think of a less privileged position in life than he grew up. And what was his purpose in all of this? So in another section, this is from John chapter 12, Jesus talks about his death. This is the time just before he died on the cross. And he refers to his death on the cross as the time of his glory, when he was glorified. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. And when's this going to happen? Verse 32 at the bottom. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. So as he was looking ahead to his crucifixion, this is what he considered to be his glory, his moment of glorification, because that's what he came to do. And that's just so extraordinary when you think about the glory that we all seek for in this world. We seek for glory from, you just read out a list of the things, some of the things I've done in my life, 200 publications. People think, wow, I published a paper, and there's a sort of sense of glory. Well, Jesus just isn't interested in that. And he cuts across all of that. But what was the consequences of Jesus' self-sacrifice in God's plan? Well, the first and most important consequence is that he brings forgiveness and he brings salvation. And every one of us needs forgiveness in our own lives. Every one of us needs to have that sense of being washed clean, of being reconciled. And we were just talking earlier about the need for forgiveness in countries and between countries, within a country, the need for forgiveness for what has gone before. And it's only through Jesus that we can know that forgiveness, and we're able to forgive others for what they have done. Now, the consequence of Jesus' death on the cross was that God exalted him. He lifted him up, and he's now in heaven. And at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. But the important point that impacts on me so much is that God puts absolutely no value on position or prestige or political power or wealth or material possessions or comfort. All these things which we seek after, they are of no value to God. And as leaders, this really touches us in terms of our motivation. So what is it that motivates you to be a leader? Is it seeking after these things, or is it to serve? So there are so many examples in the Gospels where Jesus is so critical about people's motivation. Do you remember the story of the Pharisee who loves his position in the temple? Or the story of the parable of the sower, the weeds that wrap around us in our life and prevent strong growth. There's so much about what we love in this world. In contrast, Jesus was the Son of Man who had nowhere to lay his head. And when he died, his only possession was a robe, and he was buried in a donated grave. Remember again that conversation that James and John came to Jesus, and they said, we want to sit at your right and left hand in heaven, seeking position and preference. But what was Jesus' response? Whoever wants to be great must be your servant. So this is a radical call to us about our motivation. And it's our motivation in the whole of our life. Jesus said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's what we need to be modeling our life on. That's the example that Jesus gave. So what does this mean for our lives and leadership? About motivation. So what attracts you to take on leadership of some group in the university, or attracts you to take some position inside or outside academia? Is it the advantage it will bring to you? Is it the money? Or is it the opportunity to serve? The opportunity to build something of value, to do something that promotes justice in society? So that's the first thought. It's a very, very humbling thought, I think. It's really difficult. It's a challenge to us. The next thing that Jesus calls us to is to be his character. What is Jesus like? What is Jesus like? What is your picture of what he's like? Is your picture of Jesus like somebody who is authoritative and demanding things of you? Or is it somebody who is alongside you, supporting you? So this verse has come to mean a lot to me. I've prayed it so many times. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So, I worked as a cancer doctor for many years, for 20 years in the clinic in the front line, and that subsequently leading research. And it feels very burdensome when you walk into the clinic to talk to your next patient with cancer. It feels there's a burden in doing that. And it's wonderful to be able to come to Jesus and to take advantage of this promise that he will give rest. But what I want you to think about today is this statement in the middle. What is Jesus like? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. There are very few places in the New Testament where Jesus really talks about what he's like. He acts, we can see what he's like, but where does he talk about his own inner heart? Not many places. And here he talks about it. I am gentle and humble in heart. And he invites us to come and walk alongside him. Now that is a beautiful invitation. That is such a beautiful invitation. I don't know what you're feeling like at the end of a year of lockdown. So in the UK, the last couple of days, we've just been thinking back that we've just had a whole year since the first COVID lockdown for us. And I think many people are feeling weary and burdened, and we're longing for a rest. And I guess that many of you are too. You're feeling a bit alone. You're feeling weary and burdened. And let's just think about that person of Jesus. And one of the fantastic things about this is, why does he give us this invitation? It's because he really loves us. He loves you. He actually wants to walk alongside you in your life. What did people say to Jesus when he was there? They criticized him because he was a friend of sinners and tax collectors. They criticized him because he went out and spent time with people. He would go and eat with them and drink with them. He was sociable. He spent time with people. Why was that? It's because he loved us. He loved those people. He wanted to spend time with them. He wants to spend time with you. He wants you to walk with him. It's a fantastic invitation. Come and walk with me. I wasn't brought up as a Christian. When we were kids, we never used to go to church. We didn't talk about God in the family. There was a vague sense of faith. But I began to hear about the Christian message from some holidays I went on. And then an old guy came along and spoke at a Christian group at my school when I was about 14. And he said, he quoted from a psalm, Psalm 34, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy is the man who takes refuge in him." And he said to me, to the group, and I felt as if it was speaking to me, you cannot know Jesus until you taste him. You can't know what an apple is like until you bite into it. You've got to actually take that bite to start that walk with him. And this is the same. Here's the invitation that Jesus says, come, if you're weary and burdened, take my yoke on you. Come and walk with me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You'll find rest for your souls. So if your souls are troubled, weary and burdened, whether you're a Christian, you've been a Christian for a long time, or whether you're a new Christian, or whether maybe you're just looking in from and sort of getting interested and thinking about it, the invitation is for all of us to come close to Jesus, for he is gentle and humble in heart. And this is where we will find true rest for our souls. And that's the character, the walk that we need, that will really help us grow as people and as leaders. So think of that person who I asked you to think about a little while ago, about who was a leader, who you really respect. I wonder who that person is. One guy I'd like to look back on as a Christian leader was a man who many of you may have heard of called John Stott. He was, he's written many books and was a well-known Christian teacher in London for many years. So when I was your age, when I just finished at Cambridge, I came down to London. I was doing my medical studies at University College London. I was 21, 22. And we went to the church where John Stott was the leader. And he had a group for young people at that point, about 10 of us. And it was a reading group. And it's where he used to try and keep in touch with the thinking of the day. And we would read a variety of books, usually not Christian books. So I remember there was a very popular book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Any of you read that? It was a very popular cult book at the time. And another time we read the Quran. Have any of you read that? No, very interesting to actually look into it and read it. And then we would talk with John Stott. Now, John Stott was probably at that time one of the most influential Christian leaders in the world. And he was interested to come and sit with a bunch of young students to read and to share. And he is a great example of somebody who was humble and lowly. Later on, somebody wrote a biography, and I was back at the church there, and I made a big mistake because I asked him to sign it, and you could see him recoil almost in horror because the thought of something being asked to sign a book that was all about him. It was so utterly against his character. I think he was a fantastic example in that way. So our character as Christians and as leaders is critical. So I have a very wonderful wife called Miriam, and one of the things she says to me is that the greatest compliment you can pay to somebody is to observe them and to give them your whole attention. So when you're in a room and there are people around about, are you really concentrating on that person? Or are you sort of pursuing the room to see if there's somebody more interesting to talk to or checking out what they're doing over there? And I wonder if it's something that I need to work on. I'm not very good at this, but I wonder whether, oh yes, before I move on, I just want to recommend this book. This is a book that I've been reading about this particular phrase in this verse, gentle and lonely, the heart of Christ for sinners and sufferers. It's a great book that will be maybe of use to you. But going back to the idea of the greatest compliment you can pay to somebody is to pay attention to them. Do you remember this scene? One day, Jesus was surrounded by a huge crowd, and they were pushing along, and they were going to the house of Jairus, who was one of the important people, and Jairus's child had died. And as they were going along, a woman who had been having abnormal bleeding for 12 years. So she was outcast because that made her ritually unclean in the Jewish setting. She was ill because she'd been bleeding for so long. And she just crept up and grabbed hold of Jesus's gown. And he looked around and said, "Who touched me?" And the disciples all laughed at him. I mean, there were so many people around him, crushing around him in the crowd. But Jesus knew that somebody had touched him. And he turned and he looked at that woman and gave her his 100% attention. I think that's fantastic. There's an example of him taking up somebody who was despised, marginalized, ostracized because of her medical condition. How many people there are in the world who are on the margins? And as Christians, we should follow Jesus' example and to see them. And the first thing is to see them. So often we don't even look at them. We walk by, we don't see them, but to see them and to give them our attention. So how does this affect us? So it affects the way perhaps we are looking for a position somewhere and you're overlooked for that, or your contribution is not recognized like it should be. If these things happen, how do you respond? Do you grow resentful and bitter and distance yourself? We shouldn't do that. Or if we're successful and we're applauded, does it go to your head and you begin to believe you're somebody really, really cool? Well, that wasn't Jesus's way. Gentle and lowly, and noticing and caring for the marginalized and the weak. And that's a really important characteristic of really great leaders, and a very unusual one. So a leader needs to serve. A Christian leader needs to serve. A Christian leader needs to have a godly character, gentle and lowly. And a leader needs vision. So when Jesus came to his ministry, he stood in his local church, his local synagogue, and said this: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me. He's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoner, recovery of sight for the blind, so to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." His mission. If people are going to follow you, they've got to know where you're going. You've got to know where you're going. Even on a walk, the person you follow is the person who knows where they're going. So what was Jesus's mission? Well, it was Spirit anointed and bringing in the era of the Lord's favor, the beginning and the end, the time of his blessing. And what a blessing it has been. And where was it directed? It was directed to the poor, to the prisoners, to the blind, and the oppressed. All of those marginalized people. And what does it do? It brings good news, freedom, recovery of sight, and the Lord's favor. And this vision is radical and transformative. And his work saved humanity from the consequences of our rebellion against God. He didn't just save us as individuals, he has saved the world. He brings forgiveness, reconciliation, new birth, hope of eternal life. And he established a worldwide community of believers. And his message has transformed history. The values of our civilization in the Western world are based on Jesus' teaching. I don't know whether any of you have seen this book by a chap called Tom Holland. Anybody come across that? Tom Holland has written a number of books about Roman history, Caesar, the Rubicon. I loved them. I read them, read those books. I really enjoyed his work as a historian. But this book, Dominion, is about the making of the Western world. And the case that he makes here is that so much of the Western world is actually based on Christ's teaching. He's not a Christian, but just as he's looked at it, he's seen that it has actually imbued so much of Christian values are the basis of Western civilization. And he's saying, don't forget that. So it's a really interesting book to give to, if any of you are reading history, then read it. If any of you have got somebody who you're talking to who's reading history, it's a very good read. And it shows you the way in which Jesus's mission has transformed the wider world. So what does Jesus say to us? I mean, he says to us, everybody has got a talent. Do you remember that story of the talents? Some people, he had 5, some had 2, some had 1. Everybody's got talents. And he's endowed us with talents, gifts, resources. And following Jesus involves taking those resources which he's given us and using them to the best of our endeavor. So what are your resources? resources of character, of intellect, of ability. Some people have raw talent, but for most it's about diligent practice and hard work. So Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, said genius is up 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, i.e. it's hard work. So we all have things that we inherit. I have my father's drive and innovation, his ability to see opportunities. He was a young accountant who in 1941 was working in Hong Kong as an accountant at the age of 26 when the Japanese invaded, and he was taken prisoner by the Japanese. And for 3.5 years, he was in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and he starved. And I don't know whether you can see that picture. That's not actually of him, but that's what he looked like. He was emaciated. And he had lots of experiences which he talked about after the war. He sometimes said it was the most important experience of his life because he learnt what was fundamentally important. Somehow or other, he wasn't a Christian, but he saw that there was something real in God. But he came out with very poor eyesight. He was a blind accountant, and an accountant has to be able to look at books and read the numbers and add them up. But he did manage to get a job working as an accountant in the grocery industry. And although he couldn't see very well, he had the vision to see the need for computerization in the grocery company. So his eyesight was bad, but he had vision. And one of the things that he developed was this barcoding, which we now are so familiar with. Everything in the shops has a barcode. And this is a barcode from a UK-based item. And that number 50 at the beginning is on every British produced item. And my dad chose that number because he was there innovating there. So we all have things that we get from our background, from our skills that give us talents to use. I'll say a word about forgiveness as well, because one of the things about coming out of the war for him was it's a bit like having post-traumatic stress. And maybe some of you resonate with this. I was born just 9 years after the war ended, and he came out like that. And he was at times quite angry. He had terrible stomach pain, stomach ulcers. So he had physical consequences, and he had emotional consequences of what he'd been through. But somehow or other, despite that, he didn't have a grudge against the Japanese who'd imprisoned him. And I think part of that was because there was one man who particularly, one of the guards in the camp, who they used to call Blue Eyes, used to come and help them, and would help them and somehow kept them going. So he saw some humanity in that situation. And when we reflect on difficult times, we do need forgiveness to forgive those who have done terrible things to us or to our relatives. But God can take things. For my dad, he had those visions about computerization. And it's extraordinary the way God worked in his life. At the age of 77, he actually became a real believer in Jesus through an Alpha course, which he was hosting in our house, because by then my mother had become a Christian. And on the 4th Alpha course he went to, he finally became a Christian. But let's get back to talents. I have some talents which I derived from my father. You all have talents which come to us from our gene pool, our family stories, our upbringing. They're often marred by difficult experiences. But will you use them under God? If we are orientated to following Jesus, then he often will bless us with ideas, opportunities, directions that will lead us on the great adventure of our life with him. So there have been a couple of times in my life when I have had sort of inspirational ideas. And as I said to you, for 20 years I worked in Wales. And when I first started working there in the cancer hospital there, I began doing some simple clinical research studies and built up a small team. And I thought, well, this is going well. And I can remember one day in 1997, very clearly, I remember the room where it happened. An idea came to me that I needed to develop this across the country of Wales and to link with the scientists. And that led to me setting up an organisation which we call the Wales Cancer Trials Network. It changed its name to this, CRC Cymru, which I directed for a few years. And that was part of a wave, the first part of a wave of development of clinical research support, which sort of spread through the NHS, the National Health Service. Wales, just for reference, is a small country. It's got 3 million people. Slovenia has 2 million people. This was something that was started in a small country, but it began to have a ripple effect across the whole of England. Just yesterday, I received this, the future of UK clinical research delivery. This is now a national process supporting clinical research across the whole of the health service. Some of you're all aware of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. I work in the building where those people work. I share the same labs as them. Some of you will have heard of the recovery trial, which has been running, which has identified that dexamethasone is effective for treatment of COVID and various other things aren't. That's run from the building next to mine. And all of that activity has been based on a really strong infrastructure of clinical research delivery, particularly the recovery trial is absolutely based on that. And I'm not claiming too much for this, but I do believe that that idea that came to me back in 1997, which was to establish the first clinical research network, came from God, that he helped me to set that up in Wales. In 2001, it began in the UK. I was involved in helping lead that. And just a small idea which God blessed and which has led to being a major part of the research infrastructure in the health service in Wales, which the government now supports to a tune of £330 million a year. So it's amazing what God can do through, if people will follow him and if we will honour him. So I believe that God gave me that vision. It happened another time, a bit later on in about 2007, in my own discipline, where the research organisation is in a mess, and I saw in a very formed way the way it should develop, and that again set up a new program which is continuing to thrive. So I do believe God gives us inspirational ideas. But the real model of leadership, I just want to leave with you, is the model of Jesus. We need to think in our lives, whether we're leading or whatever we're doing, what is our motivation for doing this thing? Is it for our own aggrandizement? Is it for our own position? Is it because people will respect us more or look up to us? Or is it to serve them? Is it to actually notice them, to serve them, to enable them to flourish? Brana and Bostian, as you're leading the Zvej work in Slovenia, are you helping to serving people to enable them to flourish? I think you are. It's a wonderful ministry. what is the character that you are cultivating as you follow Jesus? He calls us to walk alongside him, and he declares his own character as gentle and lowly. And that's what we should be. And Jesus had a compelling vision of bringing freedom to the captives, of bringing the good news to people, of giving forgiveness to each one. Now, he gives us that message. And as Christians, all of us have the opportunity and the privilege of being able to share that amazing message of good news with other people. And that's the greatest joy in the world. But he also blesses us, I think, with God-inspired visions in our wider life, because God is interested in this world. He wants to transform it, just as Jesus's ideas have transformed the world. He wants to continue to work through us. There's an interesting website which I came across as I was preparing this, The King Who Led with a Towel. And if any of you want to follow that up, put that into Google, and you'll see that some really useful resources there, which will help you think more about Christian leadership. Jesus, you remember, just before he died, he took off his robe and he went and washed the feet of each of his disciples. That is an extraordinary example. He came to serve, not to be served. His character was gentle and lowly, and he called his people to follow him into a life of service, which led to the transformation of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, so much. Now I would like to start a question and answer time. How do we recognize if our ambition or wish for a leadership position comes from selfish reasons or if it's God's plan?
That's a very good question. And of course, we are all mixed up in our motives, and nothing is simple. So I've laid out to you what we should aim for. And I think these decisions or these points of guidance are always challenging. Well, I'm just thinking of examples in my own life. I mean, when I came to Oxford to take up this position, that was a position that was offered to me. Was it something which I should do? Should I continue with my work in Wales, or should I come to this position in Oxford? What was the motivations there? There was certainly, it was a much more prestigious university to work in, Oxford University compared with Cardiff University. It was a senior position. So there were certainly things in it that were selfish, that could appeal to selfishness. So I think this comes down to a matter of prayer and thinking through the priorities of one opportunity versus another. And whenever you take a big decision about this, I think there are several things you should do. You should first of all ask for God to guide you, and he does. If we're following him, he does help us. But it's not often easy, and often you don't really necessarily know until after you've made the decision. But at least you should ask him. Then you should use your wisdom, weigh up the pros and cons of each position. You should take advice from wise friends who can help you. And then ultimately you need to take a decision. And then one of the things I think is really helpful is that you take a decision, but then you sort of give it a few days as you pray over that decision. And if it's actually going the wrong way, I think God's really great to disturb us and unsettle us. Whereas if it's the right way, then he gives us his peace. So I think it's the whole question of guidance, which is very challenging and is never easy, because it's always, you don't really know until afterwards. It has been a good move, and so yeah, challenging. Oh, that's a good question. If and when we see leaders who are not imaging Christ in their leadership style, how do you suggest we respond in humility? This is really challenging because it's a very real question. I think there are several ways that you can take this forward. The first of all is to try to really be clear about, is this something where their leadership is truly wrong-headed or wrong in practice? There are certainly leaders in the Christian church where they are abusing their power, and if that's really the case, then you need to talk about it with some other senior Christian person and share your concerns. And it may be necessary to confront that person. That's probably not something you should do as a younger person or on your own. But we've seen too many times that Christian leaders have continued unchallenged in their abusive behavior. So it's not something you should do on your own, but I don't think we should just cover up for people and excuse people for being abusive or domineering in their leadership style. Sometimes the only solution is to leave the church, which is a great shame. But how this is done in the context of leadership within a church is a really important question. This touches a very raw nerve, because just yesterday I heard some very disturbing things about a person who was very much a Christian leader when I was a young undergraduate, and who's been abusing his spiritual leadership position. So it does happen, and people in authority in the church need to deal with it. So it's a really good question, but people have to be held to account if their leadership is not is abusive or domineering, and it's not okay. I think the reality is that every one of us is a sinner, and that includes Christian leaders. Great Christian leaders are sinners as well, and if that sin is undermining or upsetting their ministry, they must be held to account, even if they're somebody important or high up. That's why I think John Stott was a wonderful example, because he was very widely and internationally known, and yet he was very humble and would not put himself forward. And I worry about people who put themselves forward and it becomes almost a personality cult. That's not a good sign. So, how did you continue through all these years? Keep your eyes on him. Well, thank you. That's a lovely question. So I think continuing. So I became a Christian when I was 14, and I'm now 66. So that's 52 years of following Jesus, which is wonderful. And for many years, I've not been a spectacular Christian by any means. I've struggled along, and I put it down to several things. First and foremost is the faithfulness of God. Secondly is my wonderful wife Miriam, And we together have encouraged one another, and we've always made it an absolute practice. First of all, that we go to church every Sunday. We take all the children to church. There's no question about it. That's what we do. So that's a priority in our lives. Thirdly, we prioritize making friends with Christians, both for ourselves and for our children. So that as we were growing up together, we were in a Christian community where both we as a married couple and our children had a Christian friendship group. I think another thing that's really helpful is we always pray before we go to sleep, last thing at night. And that's a really good thing to do, because it helps to, if there are things that are really not right in your relationship or in your life, it's an opportunity to sort that out. I think just one very big thing happened in our family life was that in 2001, just before 9/11 struck, we were on holiday in Italy near Assisi, and two of our children were in a very serious motorbike accident, and both of them nearly died. And that we were going along smoothly in our lives, and suddenly we hit a wall, and that was a tremendous shock. It was terrible. One was 20 and the other one was 17. And there have been long consequences from the injuries from that. But what was real was that God was there like a rock in that difficult time. And I think that's what strengthened our faith in him, and also strengthened the faith of all of our children. So we have 6 children, and through God's good grace, they all follow Jesus. And I think part of it was because of his faithfulness through the time of that terrible accident 20 years ago, which really shook us up as a family. So through hard times and in good times, eh? Yeah.
What is your advice for someone who aspires to become a Christian doctor, and how can one best combine faith with his or her medical profession?
Thank you. Well, in one way, that's very easy, because actually the whole motivation of being a doctor is very close to the motivation of being a Christian. You're there to serve people. You're there to help people. And you're equipping yourself with a set of information, knowledge, and skills that enables you to serve people better. And in the large amount of stuff that goes on in medicine, there is absolutely no conflict between being a Christian and being a doctor. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to care for people, to be honest with people, to support people. There are challenges sometimes, and in particular areas of medicine. I mentioned last week about some of the interactions I've had about in the field of euthanasia, where I've differed. I'm not in favor of legalizing euthanasia, and where I've argued for that, and that's been contentious. There are other areas around the area of abortion, or there are areas of ethical concern. But in many ways, the vast majority of what you do as a doctor is absolutely in line with your Christian faith. And it's a wonderful profession to be in. I'm so grateful that I've been able to be a doctor during my life. And so I think it's a very straightforward thing to combine faith with the medical profession. My son Daniel, who was in that accident, and he lost the use of his right arm, so he's got a paralyzed right arm. He is a consultant psychiatrist, and that's that's a very challenging area. But he is really pursuing how does faith and psychiatry work together? How do we understand mental illness in a Christian space? And it's really interesting and exciting to see him trying to work that through and trying to help others work that through. So there are these wonderful opportunities. Yeah.
How do we, as young people in a leadership position, get respect from adults?
Well, I think adults really do respect young people in leadership. I see in church, in university, in work, I love to see a young person taking leadership. And it's a wonderful thing when you see somebody taking responsibility for something and leading. So a lot of people don't. So it's wonderful to see people who do. And I think the vast majority of adults actually really enjoy that, because actually it's seeing that the younger people coming through and doing something constructive and positive. So I think unless you're in a very hierarchical and patriarchal type society, there is wonderful opportunity for young people in leadership. And I think that's more and more so. I see it really excites me seeing young people taking responsibility. As a young person at university, I was part of the leadership group of our Christian Union in Cambridge, and it was entirely student-led, and it was great fun, and it was great friendship, and it was a very great opportunity. So just go for it. People will respect you. Go for it.
How would you recommend for us to encourage others to step up and lead, either on their own or with us?
Yeah, that's good. I think people need mentoring and encouragement. So there are some people who maybe naturally are leaders, but there are many people who are rather hesitant about it. And I think then it can be really encouraging to draw people in, to give them a small role and then a larger role, and to encourage them and to feedback, and to do it as part of a team. So one of the really important things, so a lot of the time now, I'm leading big research collaborations. So I've just coming to the end of a 6-year program where I've led research across 7 universities in the UK, and these with multiple professors all around the place. And of course, when you're leading something like that, you recognize that other people really know their stuff in their field better than you do. So you don't have to pretend that you as a leader know everything. You don't have to pretend that you as a leader has to make the decisions. And part of leadership is a lot of it is listening to people, and a lot of it is hearing what they're saying and working out how you can achieve your goals with them. And it's about collaboration, and it's about working together. So leadership is not domineering. Leadership is being in the group, but it is about having the vision. So it's about serving people. It comes back, to these things I've been talking about serving people. It's about having that character of not needing to be at the front, not needing to be in the position of authority, but because of the vision that hopefully God has given you, that gives you authority to set the direction, and then God will bless that. And in your Christian group, I think if you can see if you can together or on your own, really through prayer and searching to find out what is God's vision for what he wants you to do, then go for it. Be bold. And he will bless that. And
Yeah.
you'll need tenacity, commitment to see things through, and you'll need steadiness to encourage people when they're flagging, and to listen to people when they're fed up. But if we had a session on Saturday with some of the students in Oxford, which we call Developing a Christian Mind, and I was speaking at that with one of our theology professors and one of our other medical professors, and he runs a thing called Dementia's Platform UK, and he's the leader of that. It's a research platform which sort of reaches across the world, researching into dementia. But on the front page of the website, the values of Dementia's Platform UK are about collaboration, enabling research, creativity, and integrity. Those are all fundamental Christian values. And yet there they are on the front page of this massive international research effort. And John Gallagher, who leads that, is a really committed Christian. And without saying that these things are Christian, he's put them right there on the front page of this massive international research effort. And actually, people recognize the value of that. And they feel they love it because it gives them space to work. So remember that Christian values actually work. This sort of model of leadership is the most effective leadership that there is. People who are beginning to, in the secular world, they call it servant leadership. They don't call it Christian leadership, they call it servant leadership. And people realize that it works. And that's the amazing thing about following Jesus. It works. It's the best way to live life.
What are the challenges when you need to lead the leaders?
Yeah, okay, that's a good one. So, in recent years, the last decade or so, I guess I've particularly been involved in leading people, all of whom are leaders in their fields. It's about establishing a common purpose, which is this vision thing. And people, if they share that purpose with you, and they see that actually you're not going to grab all the glory, and that actually it's about doing something together, which we can do better together than we can on our own. And it's encouraging respect for one another, so always listening to people, always inviting people to comment, always inviting their opinion on something before doing it. It doesn't always necessarily mean agreeing with everybody, because you'll have people going off in different directions, but if you at least have given them the chance to hear, to speak, to be listened to, and then explaining to people when it is not on the main track. I think people love collaborating together. If they're wanting to go in a certain direction, people really enjoy the sense of working together on a very big aim. On Monday, I'm going to go and try and get my next research grant from Cancer Research UK, which is another 5-year program of research. And we're going with a team of really excellent cancer researchers in different fields. And I'm leading that team. And so it's about recognizing the value of everybody else, what their contribution, which is unique. They're far better at what they're doing. They know their stuff, and I need them to contribute and to work with me. But it's about establishing a vision that will unite us together into that big project. It's good fun. Well, it's lovely to talk to you. God bless you and all that you're doing.